Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'd like to welcome you to a live broadcast on LaRouchePack.com. We apologize for the delay. We had technical errors in the studio here. However, tonight's webcast will be part of our regular series happening every Friday night, featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Tonight, we're joined in the studio by Jason Ross and Leandra Bernstein, who will be engaged in the dialogue portion of our broadcast tonight. So, without further delay, I'm proud to give you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Today, earlier, I had a piece from the New York Times, which I'm just going to refer to because it brings into a subject which goes into several levels and is of general significance. Now, what's happened is, as you know, some time ago, the British monarch prescribed the reduction of the human population from 7 billion people to approximately 1 billion people. We have, since the time that this plan was made, we have seen measures of reduction of human population by all means has been pushed, and it continues to be pushed. One of the measures which is something which the British copied from Adolf Hitler. You may recall that early in the days of the Hitler dictatorship, there was the introduction of a reduction of life, termination of unnecessary lives. This program was the basic program of the Queen of England a couple of years ago. The program of reducing the human population from 7 billion people down toward the goal of 1 billion people. Now, since that time that was put into place, it was put into place during the Danish period of this whole effort by the British. Well, the Danish didn't accept it. But the same program goes on. So the purpose is to reduce the human population from 7 billion to slightly over 1. That's the policy. And that doesn't mean that's what they intend. That means what they say they intend. So therefore, we've seen in this period, we've seen exactly that process underway. And there is no difference between essentially what Tony Blair set into motion for England and cooperated in pushing into the United States through the Chicago Channel that he goes through a lot of times. So that we have that. Now we're getting two different kinds of programs which all amount to a savage reduction of the human population in general, a reduction of the population in Europe, in the Eurozone, and a reduction in the United States itself. Today we had messages from Ezekiel Emanuel was reported, or his program was reported, which is in this nature. Now, what is being proposed in this report from the Times and similar sources is that they're now going at the Blair's program for reduction of the population, withdraw sustenance to bring about an end of life. So the idea of a general end of life program is an integral part of the program under this president in particular. It didn't begin with him, but he's been a key factor in pushing it. He's also, he's been killing people all over the world with complete, like Hitler-style stuff. And so we have a truly Hitler-style operation if we go back to the beginning of Hitler's reduction of life program. It's on fully now. For example, the taking of foodstuffs and converting foodstuffs into fuels under conditions where we don't have enough food to meet the coming demands of our population means that we are faced with, under Obama presently, we're faced with genocide against the American people, as well as Europeans, especially the Greeks. And now it's going to be Spain and Portugal and Italy next. We have a program of genocide, which is the opening phase program, and something more than that, of Adolf Hitler. As implicitly, this current president of ours, still sworn in now as president, is continuing to push a program which is a virtual carbon copy of what Adolf Hitler did in the beginning phase of genocide in Germany and elsewhere. And that's what's in place now. So that when we're talking about issues, we're talking about policy, first of all, anyone who is supporting the demand that foodstuffs be used to be converted to fuel, as for automobile and power sources, should be charged with being in a Hitler-like program. Obama himself, during the opening year of his presidency, of the first term, was already pushing exactly that. So that when we're talking about this, you're talking about genocide. But there's more to it than that. There is genocide, but it involves a lot of complications, as Hitler's program did too. And remember that in the tribunals on the trials of for the Nazi crimes and other crimes as well, that this beginning point of the Hitler program was also indicated to be the reason for the death sentence to those Nazi officials and others who had pushed the program. If we are today having the Hitler experience now before us, will allow the Hitler-type opening decade program with mass murders thrown in on top of it, under the personal direction of the president, starting wars, which are violations of the Constitution because there is no authorization of Congress to launch such a war or conduct it. We have a policy of mass murder is being put into view, especially by the British monarchy. Now, the British monarchy is a very interesting question. First of all, you know, we've had two 9/11 experiences recently. Right? Both 9/11 stories, the one that hit in 2001 and the one that hit recently in Benghazi, involving an official. But they're both by the same authorship, the same group, the British Saudi group combined with American accomplices. That's what we've got. And this, if we don't stop it now, it will never be stopped. So we have two horror shows. First of all, we're going very close to launching a general thermonuclear war. And what's happening from Europe in particular, from the European system, the European Union and NATO, what's going on now is exactly that. This is Tony Blair stuff. Tony Blair started a second war in Iraq, which was unwarranted and was a violation of international law. And it was pushed through with lies. Blair lied. He always lies. He's a mass murderer. He's already certified as that. So the question is, here we have an economic problem. But we don't have just an economic problem. On the idea, the insistence of this administration in forcing the conversion of food into fuel, who refuse to take the measures in agriculture necessary to create the food supply we need. And that's the problem. The measures are not being taken. So we have before us a not only deliberate genocide, but we have shameless genocide, brazenly shameless genocide, just as Hitler did in his opening phase of his genocide program. And we know what happened to that. So the question is, no one has the moral right to support Obama's wars, illegal wars, unconstitutional wars. No one has the right to still starve Americans to death by converting their food supply into fuel. And these are the measures which we have to consider. And you have this discussion in the Times. It occupies most of the editorial comment column. And it pertains precisely to this. And I won't even go through the details of what this says. It's in today's Times. But it's awful. It's disgusting. It's immoral beyond conception. It is truly the spirit of nothing less than Hitler stuff. And it's worse because it's coming now after the Hitler program experience has happened. It's now being repeated after the Nuremberg trials and everything else that goes to it. And the fraud that was conducted even in that period. Some of the things that were said and weren't said were very bad then. But this I think, is the crucial thing. We're in a period where you say talk about government policy. How can you talk about government policy without blushing? When you don't take the measures to prevent this process from continuing. Now we've got another aspect to this thing, which is also acute. The whole fraud about this shooting in Connecticut. Now the shooting happened. The apparent actors, the victims and so forth, and the self-victims, that's all true. But that wasn't done by guns. Guns were used. You can't indict a gun because the poor gun is being used. He has no willpower to decide whether he's going to be used or not. So the problem is not guns. The problem is sick people who use those guns as sick people do, mentally sick people. Well, the problem we have is we've seen since about the second year of the U.S. war in Indochina, we have seen a degeneration in the policy, a moral and a personal degeneration, which took the form of drugs and similar kinds of things, and it came just about 2 years after the second year of the war in Indochina. And you found people began running from universities. We saw what happened in Columbia, for example, Columbia University in 1948. These guys were saturated with drugs. Their ideology was criminal. The main product was spreading venereal diseases. I don't know, from Chicago into Chicago, but there was a lot of venereal disease going on. And so what's happened is we found with the lack of meaningful employment, the lack of challenging employment, intellectually challenging employment, which is what makes the difference. People have to take pride in themselves. If they don't take pride in themselves, they'll do anything. If they don't see themselves as a person of value, if they don't see what they're doing as an expression of value, they become demoralized, and so forth. What we have is a very serious problem of mass insanity among our young Americans, say in their 20s. And the cases are complicated, but they're all almost the same thing. It's a combination of drug addictions and just plain insanity. It's correlated with the fact of the lack of significant employment. By significant employment, I don't mean money. I mean an adequate income. But I mean significant employment is the opportunity to do something which defines you not as a clown, but as a person, as a productive person. And what we're seeing, and this little column from the Times, it gets to the point, we're seeing a degeneration of the population. And we see that degeneration reflected in people, including physicians, and like this lead character here on the leading item here, the same thing. What he says is disgusting. It's evil. It's disgusting. And the very speech, the argument he makes, takes us back to what I recall as what was happening in Germany early on during the Hitler government. I know how it started. All the way back to, of course, Hitler's rise to power. But I also know how it started going into Hitler's rise to power. And that what he did, in the words of murders and other kinds of things, that went from there. I know in good detail what happened. I don't know all the facts, but I know the essence of the facts of what happened not only in Germany, what happened in France on a mass scale, what happened in Italy on a largely mass scale, what we saw also in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, the same kind of thing. And the point is, if we cannot live as a people if we condone the attitudes and practices which this represents. There are many things we have to accomplish, but the problem is, I know, being an older man and having many kinds of memories from many parts of the world, I know that when something like this occurs, a state of mind of the type we see, the cover-up on what happened in Connecticut, I see that, and I know exactly where that logic is going to take us. And that it is that logic which must be stopped now. In whatever form it takes, as people at Nuremberg in the proceedings emphasized in their rulings, there are some things which, if they start, lead to something horrible. Once that is understood, when somebody tries to start the same kind of thing, you prepare to defeat and prevent the horrible.
Thank you very much, Lynn. If you're just tuning in now, this is a live broadcast with LaRouche PAC TV. It's a regular Friday night broadcast. Mr. LaRouche has just finished his opening remarks, and now we're going to have some discussion with two members of our audience gathered in the studio, Jason Ross and Leandra Bernstein. So I'd like to ask Jason to come to the podium first.
Well, and I got a question that comes from an institutional contact, and it relates to what you were bringing up about Ezekiel Emanuel. On a January 3rd report called Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers, which is kind of a... Anyway, that's their title. The head of the IMF, the head economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, had a sort of a mea culpa. He said that in Greece in particular, which implemented the policies of the IMF, the fund had assumed that for every dollar in cuts, there would only be a 50-cent reduction in output in the economy. What they found was that instead, for every dollar in cuts, the overall economy collapsed by more than that, by at least $1.50. So that meant that every cut in spending, far from reducing any budget deficit, actually increased it. These cuts in taxes have included a 25 to 50% cut in pensions, a 50% reduction in the minimum wage. There's been an 80% drop in the purchase of heating oil due to its cost, and air pollution in Athens has increased by 400% due to people going to the lower technology of wood for heat. So the conclusions of the IMF really should come as no surprise. There is a point in the economy where all the fat's been cut, and any further cuts dismantle and take apart the physical productivity of the economy, and that point was reached long ago. Today, unemployment in Greece is around 26.8%. It's reaching similar levels in Spain, and the U.S. under Obama appears obviously headed in precisely the same direction. Just recently, Obama named Esther Duflo as a member of his president's Global Development Council. Duflo was part of the team that put together these disastrous policies in Europe. So here's the question. What do you see would be the consequence if we adopted these austerity policies in the U.S., and what's the alternative?
Well, I'll tell you what the policies are. It's just what I just talked about. Exactly what I was just talking about. That they're economic policies which promote death, poverty, disease, death, so forth, and in mass insanity. When the whole issue of this always comes out with money. People want money, they say. But when how do you choose money? What do you use it for? And how do you use it if you're not a clown or a very bad kind of clown? So the way the world is being run, as long as it's under the control of the imperial forces represented by the combination of Britain, the British monarchy, British system, and the Saudi system. The British and Saudi system is in 9/11. Remember that in the original 9/11 event, the event itself was organized by the British BAE Corporation in cooperation with the Saudi Kingdom. That's how it was done. And the Saudi ambassador to New York, to Washington, was one of the active organizers of both the pilots and other sources used for 9/11. Then, of course, that government, the Bush government of that time, actually put through the cover-up on the known information collected, which demonstrated that the Saudis and the British together, through the BAE, were entirely responsible for the events of the 2001 9/11 event. We have similarly a 9/11 event. How did it become a 9/11 event in Benghazi? The current president of the United States did that. And the same presidency also voted for a suppression of any discussion of the evidence proving the original authorship of the original 9/11 operation. So we have a British-Saudi operation, which is responsible actually for both 9/11s. Now that issue is up for discussion right now, and they're trying to hold it off. But the fact is, we know the evidence so far. We know that the President of the United States himself, by implication, and what people don't tell you and what they do can both be equally the same thing. Someone who denies or tries to cover up what they did is just as guilty as if they had confessed to doing it. And when you get into this kind of stuff, like Hitler-like stuff, then the rules get tougher, because you cannot assume there's honest error or even negligent error. There's deliberate murder. And deliberate murder is to be treated as deliberate murder. And you cannot, when you have somebody saying, I don't know what's going on here, when you have a president who's ordering mass murders every week in various parts of the world, and he hasn't brought it in here publicly yet, but he will. And we've come to that point. So that's what the issue is. We have to understand what money ought to mean. Money, generically, money in all its accepted manifestations. You know, it means excluding, for example, gold and silver, platinum, because these are interchangeable things which have an intrinsic value, as these metals have an intrinsic value, because they're useful. You don't have to spend them as money. You can burn them down, melt them down, and sell them as platinum, sell them as gold, sell them as silver. And that's a form of money. It's not a very good one, but it's been used in past times, and it's money. But paper money, well, that's a question mark. When is paper money money, and when ain't it? And there is a difference, because money which is only paper money, or similar kinds of paper or agreements, is not really wealth. It's credit. Now, the problem has been, in the United States in particular, especially since 2007, when we went in 2008 into hyperinflation in the United States. It was voted in, and I scolded Bill Clinton hard for his consenting to that, to his giving his voice to that. But in that case, today, what's coming out with Geithner and so forth, who's now departing, right? long before he should be gone. But when you use money as money, and use paper money, or invisible paper money, which is more common these days with the whole program, there's no value whatsoever. Now, what happens if you take non-money, because it's only credit or non-credit? The only credit for it is more non-credit. In other words, when you go purely on money and build up all these ascending columns of so-called money, which is only circulated as the same kind of money, with no actual production, useful production engaged, what you're doing, every time you increase the money supply from the corporations that deal with money investments, you are shrinking the incomes of the entire population. In other words, the more rapidly you grow with this kind of money, runaway money, which is money exchanged for money only, you are not getting wealth. You're not getting value. You're impoverishing and ruining and breaking up the economy. So we have to get rid of this idea that money has an intrinsic value. But also the point is, even gold and silver and platinum, when used as money, are not very useful. Because by their very nature, they're just swapped around. They don't go into the production of anything. As a matter of fact, if they use in that way, they take away value, not increase it. So the only kind of money that's worth anything, real money, is credit. Alexander Hamilton's idea of credit, period. That was taken as a constitutional principle. Because he solved the problem. The United States had won its freedom, was sovereign nation, but they were bankrupt as the costs of war and so forth, and the persecution by an enemy power called the British Empire. How are we going to get money? How are we going to buy things? How are we going to get an income? And Alexander Hamilton proved in his 3 famous statements exactly how you do this thing. So Alexander Hamilton made the Americans intelligent on money. And then when they killed Alexander Hamilton, it was a murder. It was not a duel, it was a murder. Hamilton discharged his weapon upward. Then the assassin shot him, and he died from that. Now, the assassin was about to be brought to trial for that murder, and the charge was murder. The perpetrator escaped to Canada and to Britain and stayed there for some time in safety. But Aaron Burr, the perpetrator, who was a British agent, who was housed in Britain with the British royalty and the British government, who acted as a spy against the United States on behalf of the British monarchy, the British Empire, for all of his life. He introduced British banking with the case of Andrew Jackson. British banking was brought in to take over the United States by British bankers who were going to pull a great swindle against the United States, and did. The United States was bankrupted by the Jackson administration, entirely bankrupted. And his successor was even more evil than he was. And the United States never really escaped from the effect of the Jackson term, and which was really organized by the British agent Aaron Burr. And Andrew Jackson was a sub-agent of Aaron Burr. The president was. And the successor president was an agent of Aaron Burr. And I had a bunch in the New York area, and in Boston. You had a bunch of people out there who were all bankers, and they were all controlled by the British monarchy's banking system. So the United States was actually controlled. Under this mechanism, slavery was introduced to the United States, black slavery on a mass scale. States were destroyed. The Constitution was subverted and violated. It was not until the Revolutionary or the Civil War that the United States got its freedom back, even the freedom of the nation. Then we had more of this, British bankers. You had a great president who was assassinated, and the vice president, who was a British agent, Theodore Roosevelt, was actually an agent of the Confederacy circle. Woodrow Wilson was the guy who brought into being again the Ku Klux Klan, bigger than ever before, and he was the president. And these guys made policy up until the time that Franklin Roosevelt became president. And as soon as Franklin Roosevelt was dead, they began to destroy the United States in the same fashion again. And I saw every bit of it, every bit of the operation. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this kind of situation where we have an enemy power, a standing enemy of the United States since its Constitution was established. And that enemy, that British enemy, now augmented by Saudi elements of the same British system, of the British Empire, are now dominating the world and are seeking and have been seeking to destroy our United States. And we have been scarce in the number of Americans who would think clearly about this thing. But I think there are leading Americans and others today who, looking at the facts, and I certainly do try to get those facts across to them the best I can, who would recognize what patriotism is. And you find that in France even, and even in Britain, you find people who, in terms of banking, are thinking of a banking reform. And they're thinking of a banking reform which is based on the principle of a credit system, just as Franklin Roosevelt used a credit system to save the United States from bankruptcy back when he was president. The time has come that we'll get our morals back if we get our money back, which means, Glass-Steagall means you cancel government responsibility for all kinds of banking which do not correspond to our principle, our constitutional principle. That money is going to be simply set there. And these bankers, that class, they're simply going to be left on the beach. If they can make money on the beach, earn it honestly, more power to them. If they go bankrupt doing that, more power to them. But we're going to save our United States. We're going to establish a credit system of the type that was defined by the then first Treasury Secretary of the United States. And that's the solution. And so the various kinds of evil that we face, or stupidity that we face, sometimes stupidity is also a pure evil, is the issue here. And the question is, do we have the guts and intelligence to do what we have the power to do as a people, under leadership perhaps of only 5% of the total population? But if 5% of really thinking people in the population, if they have a good conscience too, is enough to organize a lot of the rest of the people to move in a useful direction. And I think that's where we are now.
Now, I have a question about that really brings together each of the three steps of the proposed three-point solution: the Glass-Steagall implementation, the credit system, and then the large-scale projects, in particular NWAPA 21. Now, just this past week, the National Geographic blog featured an attack on NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, the JFK-era mega project, which we've revised as a continental water and resource managing program. And the attack was written by an associate of the Nature Conservancy. And it begins by, reporting on a bunch of proposals to balance the water budget of the Great Colorado River, and basically goes after any and all proposals which don't fundamentally arise from the assumption that resources like water are finite, scarce, and that consumption by all means needs to be cut. Now, I'm very glad that you raised what you did at the outset of this webcast on the British monarchy and their repeatedly stated proposal to reduce the world population from 7 billion to 1, because when you look at this attack on Nawapa, and really our revival and improvement of the original Nawapa program, you look at the history of the Nature Conservancy, and what they were post World War II, in the post Hitler era, eugenics became very bad to talk about in public. So the name eugenics was altered to environmentalism. The Nature Conservancy was founded 1947 by the very authors of Adolf Hitler's eugenics policy. Thomas Huxley, head of the British Eugenics Society, Max Nicholson, another Eugenics Society leader, also part of the, founder of the Simon Population Trust, best known for population reduction and sterilization. And later on, Huxley and Nicholson, the founders of the Nature Conservancy, would come together with the Queen's consort, royal consort, Prince Philip, and the card-carrying Nazi member Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands to found in 1961 the World Wildlife Fund. But I mean, that's ancient history. That's 60 years ago. What are they today? What is the Nature Conservancy today? Well, until he stepped down to become the Treasury Secretary of the United States in 2006, the chairman of the Nature Conservancy from 2004 to 2006 was none other than Henry Paulson, also the CEO of Goldman Sachs, again, Treasury Secretary and nature lover. Oh, but then after Hank Paulson left, the now chairman of the Nature Conservancy is a gentleman named Mark Tursick, who is the former managing director at Goldman Sachs up until 2008 when he joined the Nature Conservancy. Now, I don't want to give people the wrong impression here. Not all eugenics turned environmentalist organizations are being backed by Goldman Sachs. There are other investment banks. So my question on that, all of that being said, we know the pedigree of the modern environmentalist movement. We know their financial backers, which include, of course, most famously, the Queen of England. We know also their violent opposition to any kind of creative or productive development of our national territory, of nations' territory, and what they've misnamed finite or scarce resources, such as water, energy, and food. So my question is, knowing this pedigree, what is the impact of the first step of the three-point program, Glass-Steagall, on the third step of the program, large-scale infrastructure projects such as Nawapa, our upgraded Nawapa 21?
Mm-hmm. Well, Nawapa is the easiest thing for me to categorize as to what the policy issue is. Simply, we will probably get a very large increment in water supply of the United States by Nawapa. It's the usual thing. Now, it takes a big investment, but it's a profitable investment. You get much more back than you ever spend. And that's the characteristic of a credit system. If we don't put NWAPA in, the death rate in the United States is going to increase. We see the situation now. For example, because of these kinds of policies, what we did not try to develop the water system of the United States, not even that of the Central Plains. We drove down the water supply. In other words, we did not increase the net flow of water through that acreage. Really reduced it. Why did they reduce it? Because of corporate interests took over, and they didn't want to develop the farm system as a farm system. The farm system operated by pulling down the deep reserves of the water supply. The land level subsided. The fertility of the soil was gone. The weather went bad. Why? Because we didn't do the right thing. We drained down the land area by deeper and deeper drawing up of water. And we made it dirty. We made all kinds of problems. We killed our agricultural industry. We increased a really unlawful system like Monsanto and so forth, where they own the seeds to perpetuity, and they even take a big profit on top of that as a finder's fee. So this whole process is of that nature. Now the more crucial thing, which is the same thing, but to make it more crucial, we have two categories of living species on land that we deal with. Two categories. One are species which naturally increase their value as species. The other are those which decrease their value as species. What is happening, what the greenie is a person who is determined to decrease the value of his own species without removing the feces. But that is exactly what this is. Any population, particularly the human population, that wants to go back to the Stone Age or something similar in terms of their policy, combined with the determination to have a reduction of the population from 7 billion to 1, and to make them more ignorant, to make them less productive. How many people in the United States have actual productive employment? They have make-work employment, which doesn't produce much of anything. And then on that basis, they say, well, they have to reduce the income of the families. They have to have lower wages. Why do you increase the money demands? Thereby, you reduce the population by methods of starvation and increased stupidity. Well, this is not unknown to us. This is what happened to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, in the endeavor to maintain itself, destroyed itself. And it came back later to something else. Then we had something in the Greek-speaking area. They did the same thing. They went to hell the same way. Then we had the Venetian system. Now, the old Venetian system, which replaced these other previous systems of empire, caused the greatest deadly epidemic that mankind has ever had, that we know of. So the Venetian system was the most mass murderous of all up at that time. Then they came in with a new Venetian system. Now, the new Venetian system, which was based in the Netherlands, this system was first organized itself in big bands to destroy France. So the attempt of destruction, France had been the leading nation in economic capabilities in Europe. It had been absolute leading. Louis XI. And it had created, on the model of Charlemagne early, went by the Charlemagne model and built up a great France. So what happens? the new Venetian party destroys the efficiency of France with his foolish Louis XIV. Just a fool. And got into wars which just almost destroyed France. And France never fully recovered from what had been done in that operation. Then the same creatures, went out and invaded the British Isles, committed a great slaughter of the Irish and other such things. And out of that came the birth of a new system, a new monarchy, which became the British monarchy. And the British monarchy evolved to become to the British Empire. The British Empire was designed as an empire to be a world empire by the officer who actually organized that arrangement. The British Empire is an empire, and the characteristics of, you may find the characteristics of the British population, the Irish population, the Scottish population, the Welsh population, may be quite different. Their goals in life may be more human, shall we say, much more understandable to human beings than some of the things that go on in the British court, or like Tony Blair. So, therefore, the issue here is what we're seeing in this phenomenon. We're seeing the reflection of the imperial system, the same imperial system that destroyed Troy. That principle of the imperial system. And that's what the problem is. And we're getting, again, now the United States is being subjected under British direction, British imperial direction, mind you, to destroy the population of the United States as the large sections of the empires of the past have each gone through systemic destruction, as was the original Venetian Empire did. And the human species is headed toward hell if we let that continue. Now, the other part of this process is that no species that fails to rise to a higher level of species in terms of their richness of development, no such species will survive. The whole system of the universe, whether just living systems or the human system as such, can survive without evolving to a higher form of life than it had been before. All evolution of human life, of animal life, depends upon increasing the relative energy flux density of the system of species embodied. So therefore, what these poor fools are doing, the environmentalist is an idiot, but a dangerous idiot, who wants to kill his own species as much as possible. And this is the lesson of the evils that have happened in the region, that region of the planet, the Mediterranean region, in known history. No species can survive if its role in its own life is to lower the standard of living of that species, the standard of development and self-development of that species. Whole species, most of the species that have existed on this planet are dead. Not just the people or the individuals, but the whole species is dead. Anyone who wants to follow this policy is saying, well, let's make the entire human species go dead. That's his policy. Now, I think the best thing we could do is declare people who have that belief clinically insane and put them under protection so they can no longer continue to harm themselves or others.
Well, speaking of sanity, you had written a very interesting paper after the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, in which you discuss the the question of what is sanity. It was what Rumsfeld is Strangelove too, and it seemed like an interesting question because there's a lot of discussion about what insanity is. We've been discussing that on and off in these webcasts recently about the youth culture, the problems that people have. And then in terms of actually creating a active approach to what sanity is, I have a question for you about your approach to economics and your relationship with your friend Bernard Riemann. Because you've got a very unique approach. One where, as I find it, with meetings, with political meetings, with discussions in the House of Representatives, people have got a lot of problems understanding things in economics that are actually very simple. Basically because they've got a lot of very wrong views, such as looking at an economy in terms of money and other more specific ones. And that's not something that you don't seem to be afflicted by that problem. Now, in your new paper, whose name I don't recall at the moment, your latest paper on the website, you discuss the connection between your thoughts as a young man when confronted with Euclidean geometry and your rejection of that in favor of a physical approach to geometry. And you recount your later exposure to Bernard Riemann as sort of putting these things together for you. I was wondering if you could tell us how Riemann, or how this idea has shaped your view of economics.
Well, there are two parts of Riemann's paper, habilitation paper, dissertation. One part is the opening part, which just tears apart all the garbage that was conventional in that time. It's a beautiful, delightful, it was a rich experience all on its own. Now there are middle parts which begin to pull together certain crucial foundations of a new system, distinct from the one that he's proposing to junk. And this goes to a certain point. Then the whole thing gets more and more fun in a new way, up until one point which is very interesting, because there's a concluding section which lays out a whole positive conception of what the physical principles are of economy, in fact. But then there's a last sentence, and it's really a gem. It's like, there's another famous statement like that, since we're all idiots, we'll have to do something different. And this is the kind of thing that Goethe did with some of his witticisms back in that good time. But the last sentence, since we're not mathematicians but physicists, we're going to stop our report right now and go on to something new. And that's the way it goes, constantly. So that people were believing in, well, there's also a deeper question here. Is our conception of society, conception of humanity, really sane? Aren't there principles which is what we believe about sense perception? Is that true? And I say, no, it's not true. If you look at the history of species, you divide the animal species, for example, into two categories. One category is, well, people who like money. The other category is those who like the future of mankind. And that's the difference, and that's what Riemann represented. And you see this. It comes most to the fore. That specific thing comes most to the fore with Max Planck and Albert Einstein. They are the two most typical people who represent that bridge of what Riemann intended, what Riemann's intention was. It goes into many things which are valuable. He didn't live very long, so what he did for Italy, science in Italy, was tremendous. He practically created Italian science. And it involved all kinds of wonderful things, which I dealt with in terms of some of my projects back in the strategic defense period. And it was all already there. And it was Riemann who, with his relationship with this group of Italian friends, largely from northern Italy, but they moved down around Rome and had this big lake, they did different things. And so he actually created a leap in science, which is specifically a branch of his work. because he had this disease, and he was going to die of it, because the whole family had this particular type of tuberculosis. And so he would live more and more of his time in Italy, because he couldn't stand the cold climate, because he was dying, effectively. And he was spending his time while dying in working with his Italian friends, and made some absolutely brilliant achievements. And I saw some of those in various museums and in talking to people. And when I did the space program, which I did then, that was one of my plain features. I actually had an Italian designer who designed the aircraft, which was used intensely to get to Mars. And that was an Italian designer who changed the configuration on a plane, and with a known fuel system, a type of fuel system, and that would have worked. I don't know if it would have gotten to Mars, but I wasn't worried too much about that at that time. I thought about 40 years we should be able to do something in that direction. But that was the idea. But Riemann is very precious to me, because he has, despite the kind of sad life in terms of health care that he lived, and the kind of conditions under which people in science lived then, that this man had a tremendous sense of humor, which you find displayed in the opening section of his habilitation dissertation. He tears every piece of idiocy apart before getting on to serious business. Now, the man is brilliant. He's one of the greatest minds. And I put him together immediately. He belongs together with Max Planck, who was really a super genius in many respects. He was a great musician, as well as being a great physical scientist. And he had similar affinities with Albert Einstein, who had similar kind, a musician and scientist. And so these kinds of people are the ones who, from proximate to my own existence, are the ones that I feel most comfortable with.
Now I'd like to ask the final question, and I'd like to return to, again, something you brought up in your initial, your opening statement about really the overall condition of the future of the United States in terms of health care, what you raised here previous weeks about the mental health care available to people in the United States. And it's interesting, we recently published a report that came out on the United States, titled U.S. Health in International Perspective, Shorter Lives, Poorer Health. And basically this report compares the health in the United States to, I believe it's 16 other industrialized nations, and essentially in terms of male life expectancy, the United States is ranked at the lowest of all the other OECD nations. We're less healthy and die younger. If you make it past 75, you are golden. It actually came out in the report. If you're past 75, you're basically going to live as old as Moses. But for people who are under 50, the likelihood of their dying, not just from homicides, not just from drug-related deaths, but from preventable deaths, from diseases that we can prevent, is at a high for all industrialized nations, and now this obviously is in part in the context of the flu epidemic in the United States, where, on top of high infant mortality, which this report discussed, we now have people young infants and elderly dying of the flu. And here we are in the 21st century. But while we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, we still don't have sufficient healthcare. And I'm reminded of a report that came out from the chief of the International Red Cross on the situation in Great Britain. That was where the chief of the Red Cross was asked, do you see the possibility for unrest, violent unrest, as a result of the socioeconomic conditions in Europe? And the answer was absolutely. The answer was, and he put it very well, describing the situation of people, you could say under 50, but then largely, under 30, who have decades of their adult life in front of them. He said of these people, when you feel unfit for your society, like there's no place for you, that there's no hope, that the way you connect with the government and with your society is very off. And with the situation worsening, with poverty on the rise, with state aid, we're 4 years into a major economic meltdown. State aid, federal government aid is all being ratcheted down, taken away. That's the story of Obamacare. And you have a generation coming into adulthood, a generation in adulthood, that still has decades to live. And I mean, I'll just throw out a few more statistics that right now in the United States, the largest, almost the largest portion of people who are on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the food stamp program, are children under the age of 18. And you have similarly within that age bracket a report that just came out, I believe, yesterday, that in that under 18 age bracket, 1 in 25 youth have attempted suicide. And so this is a haunting picture of the future, and I just like to get your perspective.
Well, despite all that, I am intrinsically an optimist. I'm not an optimist in terms of what might drop on my lap. I don't believe that things generally drop on my lap unless they're friends who want me to do something good and so forth, and which I'm happy to do, unless there's something wrong with it. But the problem here is that we can cure this, and human beings can cure things by will, by policies, which are willful policies which can provide the means of the cure. Now, the destruction of society is reversible. Society's destructiveness has been reversed before, but it's never been on quite this scale, of course, nor this profundity, nor the rate of decline of a leading nation, as in the United States, or what the so-called Euro system in Western Europe and Central Europe. Nothing like this. It's a matter of will. If we will, effectively, some of us, just say, give me 5% of the population, 5% of the leading thinkers in the population, and let us make the policies which answer the definable problems of the United States today, both our own internal problems and the problems we have with other nations, to share with other nations. If we were to do what, in all modesty, what I would do right now if I had my druthers on this question, I could guarantee you a policy which, if carried out, will save this nation. And if we can save this nation, we can inspire the rescue of the planet, the people of the planet. So we are not doomed to an absolutely certain predetermined destruction of humanity. we are condemned to respond to known measures which are largely known to me, known measures which will cure this problem. Now, the way that works is I saw the destruction, the real level of destruction of post-war United States in two steps. The first step was Truman. The second step was the assassination of our president. And what happened immediately, within a very short period of time, from the assassination, you began to see moral degeneration of an accelerated, unbelievable type within the U.S. population as a trend. Now, these were people who were young people, college age or somewhat younger, but originally the college age types, going to what are considered the best universities, like Columbia University and so forth. And what you found was degeneration, not with every part of the population on those universities, but with a growing activist group. It was like the riots of 1968 in Chicago. This was real degeneracy, but this had gone with a problem. What was the first thing? Drugs, strange kinds of sex, these kinds of things. And we produced a massive population of degenerates, like the degenerates who were associated with our current president. And he was the crony of these people. He was cultivated by them. And they were the degenerates. We had a whole mess, a spread, from people who had been as children. You would think they were promising young people, say in 1960, 1962, you would think of these, even 64, you would think these young children are a promising new generation, despite Truman. And Truman was evil. But despite that, so that we had then the ability, under the leadership of that president, to rebuild something, as was shown clearly by the launching of the moon shot, NASA. The very fact, the assassination of Kennedy, and the quick beginning of it frightened President Johnson, who admitted he was terrified. He said, if I don't go along with this war, they're going to shoot me next. I can see the rifles aimed at me. That's what he said. And he acted that way. He gave in. And he gave in all the way to the doors of hell for the United States. And since that time, the United States has never made a single net step in policy which did not lead to downward. We've destroyed our industries. We destroyed our technology. We've done everything. We can reverse that, because we have a moment now when a very large part of the population, I would say easily 5% of the total population, which tends to be a leading part of the population. They're the activists who will act on the basis of knowledge, will and knowledge. If we do that now, if we get through immediately, Glass-Steagall first, a credit system added to that, and then a project like NWAPA and something to rebuild the equivalent of our mass industrial capabilities before, high-tech industrial. If we do those three things and come in with a protective measures to protect people who are now put in danger by these conditions they live in. In other words, immediately put one law through, cancel all this conversion of foodstuffs into oil, into fuel. Don't be fuelish. That's your dinner that's being cooked. So if we are in a position where reality before us, what could be done? And I can tell you, with the will of the upper 5% of the U.S. population, upper 5% intellectually and morally, as people who decide to become moral again, If they do that, with that kind of program, we can inspire a rescue of humanity from this nonsense. But the first thing we have to do is punish all liars. People who say they're happy when they're not happy. People who say, I admire my president, when they hate him. This is the kind of thing you have to watch out for. But if we simply now, we have the means in our hand, the physical means. If we do one thing, if we just cancel Wall Street, let it go off by itself, if it can sit on, little shade places they congregate in and try to peddle things, and they say, don't bother them, just leave them alone. But don't bail them out. That's very bad for them. It destroys their character if you bail them out. They've got to live the hard life and make it the hard way. You work their way up from the bottom. But really, seriously, if we get 5%, the upper 5% intellectually and morally, of this nation to assemble around the policies which I know have to be done now, and there's nothing, I don't think there's much I don't know about that aspect of it. If we do that, make those corrections, we as the United States, by coming back to ourselves, by making those kinds of decisions that have to be made now, urgently, we can inspire the rest of the world to do likewise.
So that brings a conclusion to our webcast tonight. I would like to say before we sign off that, as most of our viewers do know, there is a bill currently in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, which was introduced by Representative Marcy Kaptur, which is H.R. 129. This is identical to what H.R. 1489 was in the 112th Congress. And our entire national organization and our entire national movement is in high gear, mobilizing for the immediate passage of H.R. 129 in the House of Representatives and an introduction of an identical bill in the United States Senate. So thank you very much for watching tonight. Thank you, Jason and Leandra, for being a part of our broadcast. And thank you, Lynn. Good night and stay tuned.